I cursed God for taking my child, but he gave me a miracle. Ex-Atheist testimony. She remembers that day as if it had been carved into her very soul, a wound that would never fully heal. The morning had started like any other, ordinary, unremarkable, filled with the small routines that make up daily life. Breakfast dishes were still in the sink, toys were scattered across the living room floor, and her little boy's laughter echoed in her memory as though it were still happening. She never could have imagined that within hours, that laughter would fall silent forever. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Children are supposed to outlive their parents, not the other way around. Yet the unthinkable happened. Her son, her joy, her entire world was suddenly taken from her. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't something she could prepare for. It was an instant, an irreversible moment where everything shattered. The phone call came without warning, pulling her into a nightmare she never asked for. On the other end was a trembling voice, words broken, almost hesitant to speak the truth. An accident. That's all she heard at first. An accident. Her knees buckled before she could even process the details. She dropped the phone, the sound of it clattering on the tile floor barely audible over her own scream. Rushing to the hospital was a blur, each red light feeling like a dagger, each second an eternity. She prayed, though she didn't even know to whom she prayed. Please, not him. Take anything else but not him. But when she arrived, the sterile white walls, the smell of antiseptic, and the hollow look in the doctor's eyes said it all. Her little boy was gone. Time stood still. She heard the words, but they didn't make sense. How could her son, her baby, the one she kissed goodnight only yesterday, be gone? It wasn't possible. Her mind refused to believe it, yet her body collapsed under the truth. Her arms ached, reaching out for a child who was no longer there. Her chest burned with every shallow breath, as if her very soul was being torn apart. The hospital staff tried to speak to her, tried to explain, but nothing mattered. All she could see was the absence. All she could feel was the hollow space where his laughter used to be. There was no sound louder than that silence. The minutes after the news felt like drowning. She could hear voices, but they were muffled, distant, like she was underwater. Someone placed a hand on her shoulder, but it felt cold, meaningless. No comfort could penetrate the abyss inside her. She begged to see him one last time. When they finally allowed it, she entered the quiet room, and there he was, small, still, innocent, as if he were only sleeping. But the truth was undeniable. His chest no longer rose and fell. His warmth was gone. She touched his hand, hoping desperately for movement, for a miracle, for anything. But all that came was the devastating realization that he would never wake again. The days that followed blurred into one another, a haze of tears and numbness. The house was unbearably quiet, every corner a reminder of what she had lost. The sound of his footsteps no longer echoed down the hallway. His toys remained where he had left them, as though waiting for him to return. The silence screamed louder than any words could. She found herself sitting in his room for hours, clutching his blanket, inhaling the faint scent of him that still lingered. She wanted to believe he might come running through the door, smiling, asking for his favorite snack. But reality was merciless. The funeral was a blur she could hardly endure. People spoke words of comfort, yet every sentence felt hollow. He's in a better place, they said. But what better place could there be than in his mother's arms? Flowers surrounded his tiny casket, but no beauty could disguise the cruelty of the moment. She stood there frozen, her body trembling as they lowered him into the ground. Her mind screamed in rebellion. This isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to be. Yet the dirt fell anyway, sealing the reality she wished she could undo. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house pressed down on her like a weight. She would wake in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear him call out for her. But the rooms remained silent, the darkness unbroken. She would reach for the space beside her, imagining his little arms curled around her. But there was nothing but emptiness. Sleep became impossible. Grief consumed her like a fire, and every breath felt like a betrayal. Because she was alive while her child was not, her body bore the signs of her pain. She stopped eating, stopped caring for herself. Every movement felt heavy, meaningless. Friends came by, bringing meals, offering prayers, trying to comfort her, but she pushed them away. How could they possibly understand? How could anyone who hadn't lost their child tell her that time would heal? No amount of time could bring him back. No amount of kind words could erase the image of his lifeless face. Her grief was raw, unfiltered, and consuming. She often wandered to the park where they used to play. She would sit on the same bench where she once watched him run, climb, and laugh without fear. Now she watched other children playing, their voices piercing her like knives. Each laugh reminded her of what she had lost. Each happy face was a cruel reminder of the face she would never see again. Parents called their children to stay safe, to come closer, and every time she heard it, her heart broke again, because her child would never come when she called. In those early weeks, the loss became her identity. She was no longer herself. She was simply the mother who lost her child. Every morning she woke, the pain was there to greet her, sharper than the day before. Every night she went to bed with tears soaking her pillow. She felt cursed, abandoned, punished. The world continued moving. People went to work, laughed, celebrated birthdays. But her world had ended. Nothing could restore what had been taken. And in the deepest part of her soul, a bitter thought began to grow. If there truly was a God, then he had betrayed her. The rage did not come suddenly. It had been simmering under the surface from the moment she realized her boy was gone. At first, people expected her to collapse into quiet grief, into resignation, but what grew inside her was fire. She could not bow her head and whisper prayers she no longer believed in. Instead, she lifted her face to the sky and screamed until her throat burned. Neighbors heard her cries, but she did not care. "Why him? Why my son?" she shouted into the night. Each syllable carried the weight of her shattered heart. Silence was unbearable. If there was a God, then he would have to listen to her fury. If he was as powerful as they claimed, then he was guilty of the cruelest theft a mother could endure. The walls of her home became witnesses to her defiance. She paced back and forth, her hands trembling, her voice rising in curses. She tore at the Bible someone had left on her table, throwing it across the room. Pages scattered like broken promises. "You say you're a God of love," she spat. "Then where was your love when my baby was begging for air?" Her bitterness fed on itself. She could not stand the sight of crosses, could not endure words of comfort from those who claimed he was in control. Every time someone said her son was in heaven, she felt sick. Heaven meant nothing to her if it meant separation. She wanted him here, breathing, laughing, alive. And so she cursed heaven itself. Friends grew cautious around her, their words measured, their visits shorter. They had hoped to help her heal, but the flames of her rage burned too brightly. She saw their pity, and it only deepened her anger. "Don't tell me about God's plan," she snapped at one friend who dared mention it. What kind of plan destroys a child and leaves a mother in ashes? She began to reject anyone who brought up prayer, anyone who tried to point her toward faith. To her, they were blind, worshipping a cruel master. If God existed, then he had proven himself a tyrant. And if he didn't exist, then she had wasted too many years tolerating lies. Either way, she had no room left for reverence. Nights turned into battlegrounds. Alone in her room, she shouted into the dark, not caring if anyone or anything answered. She hurled accusations into the silence. Murderer, liar, fraud. Her throat grew raw, her voice breaking, but she refused to stop. It was almost as if she wanted to provoke him, to drag him out from the shadows to face her pain. She dared him to prove himself, dared him to make sense of what had happened. "If you're real, show yourself," she demanded. "But you won't, because you're a coward. You take children and hide behind mystery." Her words echoed off the walls, falling back on her like stones. She stopped entering her son's room because the sight of his bed filled her with too many conflicting emotions. At times she wanted to pray beside it, but her rage would always interrupt. Prayer felt like betrayal to the anger that fueled her survival. Instead, she sat in the living room, gripping his blanket in her fists and whispering curses against the God she once pretended not to need. Her chest shook with sobs, but her voice stayed sharp. She told herself that if God had ears, he deserved to hear her fury. If he had eyes, he should watch her suffer and understand that she would never forgive him. Her grief became a weapon aimed at heaven. Even in public, her bitterness slipped through. When someone in the grocery store told her they were praying for her, she snapped back, "Save your prayers. They're useless." At the funeral of another child, when the pastor spoke of hope in Christ, she muttered loudly enough for people to hear, "Hope is a lie." These outbursts shocked some, offended others, but she did not care. Shame no longer mattered. Respectability had no meaning when her child was 6 feet under. If God had any power, she wanted him to strike her down for her words. When he didn't, she only grew more convinced he was either non-existent or cruelly indifferent. The bitterness poisoned her thoughts. She began writing in a journal, not with reflections of healing, but with declarations of her hatred. Line after line filled the pages. "I hate you. You are no God. You are a thief. You are a fraud." She wrote as if daring him to respond in thunder, daring him to prove he was listening. When lightning cracked during storms, she stood at her window, mocking. "Is that the best you can do?" she whispered. "Show me your power, or admit you have none." Her rage had become her new religion, and defiance her only prayer. Yet beneath the fury was a wound that bled constantly. Her cursing did not soothe the ache. If anything, it deepened it. Nights grew longer, lonelier. She felt the emptiness of shouting into silence, but admitting that silence hurt worse than admitting his existence. Still, she could not stop. The cycle repeated: anger, tears, exhaustion, and then anger again. Her life became a storm that never ended, her voice hoarse from screaming into the heavens. If God was testing her, she vowed he would regret it. If he was ignoring her, she swore she would make him pay with every word of hatred. She clung to her anger because it was the only thing that made her feel alive. Love had been stolen, peace was unreachable, and hope seemed laughable. But anger was within her grasp. It burned in her veins, kept her from collapsing entirely. She saw it as her strength, her rebellion against a God who had failed her. She even told herself that her curses were proof of her courage, proof she wasn't like the others who bowed their heads in blind faith. If God wanted worship, he would not get it from her. All he would get was fury. All he would get was venom. But as the weeks dragged on, even her fury began to taste bitter. It gave her no relief, no answers, no comfort. Her screams bounced back as echoes, her curses dissolved into air. The emptiness inside her only grew, gnawing at her like a hunger that could not be fed. She had declared war on God, but in that war, she was the only one bleeding. Still, she refused to surrender. With every breath she had left, she vowed to continue her revolt. If he wanted her heart, he would never have it. If he wanted her love, he would never receive it. She was determined to hate him, even if hating him destroyed her. The fire of her rage did not burn out. It turned cold, hard, and unyielding. Where once she screamed into the night, now she simmered in silence, convinced there was no one listening anyway. Her fury hardened into disbelief, a wall she built to protect herself from further disappointment. She told herself that God did not take her son because God did not exist. People whispered of divine will and heavenly plans, but she sneered at them. "Don't you see?" she thought bitterly. "There's nothing out there. Nothing but empty skies." Her tears dried, replaced with a cruel sort of clarity. Faith was nothing but fantasy, and she would never again waste her breath on prayers that went unanswered. She began to cut ties with anything that even hinted at religion. The cross necklace she once wore, as a mere decoration, never with much conviction, was thrown in the trash. The Bible that sat dusty on her shelf was shoved into a box and buried in the closet, as if its presence mocked her. When neighbors invited her to church for comfort, she laughed bitterly and slammed the door. At her lowest, she mocked them openly. "How can you worship a God who steals children?" she demanded. Their silence, their discomfort, only confirmed her belief that their faith was weak, fragile, and blind. It wasn't just rejection. It was bitterness that grew like poison in her chest. Any time she heard someone say, "God is good," she wanted to scream. Good? What kind of good leaves a child in the ground while parents are left to rot with grief? She could no longer stomach gospel songs or sermons that drifted from radios. If one played in a store, she turned and walked out. Faith became to her a cruel joke, one she wanted no part in. And so she closed her heart completely, convincing herself that she was stronger without illusions. Friends who once prayed for her began to keep their distance. She saw the disappointment in their eyes when she rejected their words, but she no longer cared. In fact, she took pride in her bluntness. To her, honesty mattered more than comfort, and her honesty told her there was no God. When she saw families bow their heads in prayer before meals, she rolled her eyes. "Talking to the ceiling won't save you," she muttered under her breath. She wore her disbelief like armor, a shield against vulnerability. Faith was weakness, she decided, and weakness had no place in her shattered world. The bitterness infected even her language. She stopped saying "thank God" in casual moments, stopped even acknowledging the cultural habits that tied people to belief. Instead, she replaced them with cynical remarks. "Thank chance," she would say mockingly, or "thank nothing." It was her way of declaring independence from a deity she had once cursed. The irony, though, was that her disbelief still revolved around him. Even as she denied him, he remained the shadow in every corner of her mind. But she refused to admit it. She clung to her denial as if it were the only rope keeping her from drowning. Her rejection was not only spiritual but emotional. She distanced herself from religious relatives, skipping holidays that reminded her of faith. She stopped attending gatherings where prayers were said. Instead, she immersed herself in distractions, work, endless television, anything that could drown out the whispers of grief that still haunted her. Yet no matter how far she tried to run, silence always followed. Silence after the laughter faded. Silence after the busy hours ended. Silence that reminded her of the empty bed that once held her child. And in that silence, disbelief was the only shield she could cling to. She tried to redefine herself through logic and reason. Science, she decided, was the only truth worth holding on to. She read articles, books, anything that reinforced her skepticism. Evolution, biology, medicine, these became her scriptures. She memorized arguments against faith, arming herself with words she could throw back at anyone who dared to mention God. "Miracles don't happen," she declared. "They're just coincidences people romanticize." She convinced herself that her pain had opened her eyes, that she was smarter now, free from the crutch of religion. But deep down, cracks remained. Though she denied God, she could not deny the gnawing emptiness inside her. At times, late at night, she caught herself staring at the ceiling, tears sliding down her face. The questions she tried to bury would surface. If there's nothing, why does this hurt so much? If there's no God, why am I still angry at him? She shook these thoughts away quickly, forcing herself back into disbelief. Faith was a wound she could not touch without bleeding. So she buried it deeper, convincing herself that unbelief was strength. The anger that once fueled her had turned into a cold numbness. She didn't scream at the heavens anymore. She didn't curse or demand answers. She simply shut her heart and told herself there was nothing to answer to. And yet sometimes, in that numbness, the silence felt heavier than the rage had ever been. Still, she refused to let go of her resolve. If life was cruel, then she would face it without illusions. If death was the end, then she would stare into it without fear. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Her identity became tied to her disbelief. Whenever someone tried to comfort her with words of faith, she pushed them away with sharper edges. "Don't waste your breath," she said. "Your God doesn't exist. He never did." It became her mantra, her shield, her creed. She thought she was building a fortress of strength, but in reality, she was only enclosing herself in loneliness. Still, she clung to her disbelief because the alternative, opening her heart to God again, felt impossible. To trust Him after what happened, to believe He cared, no. She would rather die in denial than ever bow her head again. The days dragged like heavy curtains, each one falling the same as the last. Morning light spilled into the house, but it no longer warmed anything. It only illuminated the shapes of absence. She moved through rooms by habit, performing tasks that felt mechanical, making coffee she didn't drink, folding laundry he would never wear again, clearing a plate from the table that no small hand would reach for. The rituals of life had lost their meaning. Each motion reminded her of what was gone. Every corner held an echo of him, a tiny sneaker under the couch, a crayon left uncapped, a blanket folded on the armchair. Those ordinary objects became sharp instruments, reopening the wound with every glance. The silence settled like dust, thick and smothering, making air itself hard to breathe. Grief settled into a slow rhythm, a loop of days that blurred into nights. She would wake and remember, and the remembering would flood her until she could barely stand. It wasn't just sorrow. It was a dull, relentless weight that pressed on her chest and made moving feel like a betrayal. People told her to take it one day at a time, as if days were something she could measure and control. But time stretched, elastic and cruel, pulling her through small, empty hours. Meals became optional, laughter foreign. Sometimes she'd catch herself staring into space, fingers tracing patterns on the table, searching for a touch that would never come. The world around her kept functioning. Mail was delivered, seasons changed, but inside, the clock had stopped. The house, once full of life, felt cavernous and cold. Rooms that used to radiate warmth now held only shadows. At night, she would sit by the doorway to his room, feeling the floorboards under her feet, listening for the tiny patter of feet that would never return. She kept his toys exactly where they'd been left, as if moving them might erase the memory of him. Friends suggested clearing things away, making space for healing, but she couldn't. To give up his things felt like surrendering the last proof he had ever existed. So the toys stayed, ghosts of laughter preserved in plastic and fabric, each one a reminder of a presence she could no longer touch. Loneliness wrapped around her like a second skin. People tried to visit, to bring casseroles, to say the right thing, but their well-meaning words drifted off like leaves in the wind. She appreciated the effort, but the company often felt like noise, an intrusion into a private pain that could not be translated into consolation. Calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined. Her husband, when he tried to speak, found only short answers or silence. Grief had a way of isolating everyone in their own private storm. She watched couples with children from afar, their small faces alive with mischief, and felt a hollow ache so deep it made her stomach twist. It was as if she were watching someone else's life from behind thick glass. The small pleasures that had once filled her days, a cup of coffee at dawn, a walk in the park, lost their color. Even sunlight felt like a stranger. She used to find solace in small routines, in the predictability of errands and grocery lists, but now those things were merely tasks to be checked off. Her appetite disappeared. Food tasted bland and meaningless. Sleep came in fitful patches, haunted by dreams that always ended with sudden waking to the same terrible reality. Sometimes she drifted into sleep and woke with a sense of relief, only to have it ripped away when consciousness returned. The cycle of hope and crash became exhausting. Sometimes she found herself talking to him aloud, voice small and foolish in empty rooms. She'd say the simplest things, "I made your favorite dinner," or "I saw your drawing today," and then apologize for speaking to someone who could no longer answer. Those confessions felt like lifelines, threads connecting her to what had been. Yet the silence that greeted her responses was absolute. No whisper, no echo, no reply. Her words fell flat, swallowed by the house. She began to feel ridiculous for expecting anything else. The private conversations with his memory were both balm and torture. They kept him close, and every kept memory was a fresh wound. Questions piled up inside her like unread letters. Why did this happen? How could a world that allowed such cruelty claim to be just? Each why multiplied into more painful queries with no answers at hand. The theological answers she'd once heard, about purpose, about taste of heaven, about mystery, sounded hollow now, even insulting. They failed to touch the raw place in her chest. When family members offered platitudes, she felt anger flare again. She didn't want explanations. She wanted her child back. The intellectual frameworks that once felt comforting were suddenly brittle and useless, unable to hold the weight of her sorrow. Days of sorrow turned into a strange, numb endurance. She carried on because living felt automatic, not because she had hope. Bills needed paying, work obligations waited. People depended on her. Expectation and obligation demanded movement even when her heart refused to join. Sometimes she forced a smile, a small performance to maintain appearances for those who asked. Other times she simply sat, letting hours pass like stones falling into a deep well. There was a constant background noise of tasks to do, appointments to keep, but none of it reached the core of her pain. It was like living behind a veil, present in form, absent in spirit. Guilt became another companion. She caught herself replaying moments. If only she had checked a little longer, if only she had insisted on one more test, one more watchful minute. Regret carved its initials into her days. Each, if only, felt like a new blade. She remembered the last hug, the last "I love you," wondering if she had said enough, done enough. The what-ifs were cruel illusions of control, if only she could reorder the past. Guilt whispered that perhaps she had some responsibility to have been more vigilant, even though logic knew it's irrational to shoulder the impossible. Still, the mind held its accusations, and she bore them with weary resignation. Amid the thick fog of gloom, there were moments, brief, brittle, when she glimpsed something like a life she once led. A neighbor's laughter, a child's birthday party down the street, sunlight on a garden. Tiny sparks that felt like betrayal for being beautiful when her world had collapsed. Those sparks made her angry in their innocence. How could life continue its small celebrations when her son would never experience them? Likewise, any joy or humor that touched her family felt like an intruder. She resented the world for its indifference, its refusal to mirror her loss in equal measure. The disparity between the ordinary pleasures around her and the absence at home widened each day. Every now and then a thought rose, soft and unwelcome. What is the point of going on? The question hovered like a shadow at the edge of her life. She saw people living, laughing, loving, making future plans, and wondered what future could mean without him. The familiar sense of purpose had been replaced by a raw survival instinct. Wake, breathe, endure. Yet beneath that survival, a fragile ember lingered, an unspoken, unacknowledged thread that she clung to, however faint. It was not hope, not yet. It was simply the smallest refusal to let the darkness finish her. She could not name it, but it kept her moving through heavy days that felt like an endless echo of absence. Friends and family came like weather. Some days a gentle drizzle of casseroles and soft words, other days a downpour of visitors who meant well, but left her feeling sodden and raw. At first, they poured themselves into her life, showing up with hugs and platters and folded laundry, trying to patch what felt irreparably broken. She appreciated the effort in the abstract, the idea that people cared, but each approach felt like a small intrusion into a private, jagged wound. Their faces were earnest, their eyes watery, and their phrases were familiar. She's in a better place. Time heals. God knows what he's doing. Those sentences meant to soothe landed like salt on an open cut. She found herself recoiling, not because she wanted to punish them, but because every platitude was a fresh reminder of the thing that had been taken. When someone said, "God knows what he's doing," she felt a rage so immediate it surprised her, like cold water poured over an open flame. How could any of them speak of purpose while her child lay in the ground? Their certainty felt like a dismissal of the magnitude of her pain. She wanted to scream at them, to make the world hear the size of her loss. Instead, she learned to smile thinly, to nod politely while her interior boiled. She became expert at polite exits, at taking phone calls and stepping into the yard until the moment passed. The kindness of her friends baffled her. They didn't see how their words, though meant to comfort, left scars. Some tried a different tact: silence. They would sit with her without speaking, offering presence instead of words. Those were the visits she sometimes accepted, because silence matched her mood. It acknowledged that language was flimsy in the face of a wound like this. But even silence had its limits. After a while, people stopped coming altogether. Schedules and lives reasserted themselves, the casseroles dwindled, the messages became less frequent. Grief had an ugly way of outliving other people's attention spans. The loneliness that followed was not just the absence of visitors, but the knowledge that life moves on, with or without you. She had imagined that friends would be anchors, but many became strangers. Invitations that once felt warm now felt like obligations she couldn't meet. A text that read, "Thinking of you," would sometimes make her chest ache because thinking wasn't doing. It was a placeholder for real help. She resented those who moved quickly to getting back to normal. Normal felt like betrayal. The families who tried to include her in outings were met with a flat refusal. She could not yet bear other people's laughter, other people's small complaints, other people's ordinary troubles. Her world was reduced to raw edges, and ordinary life felt like a show she had been forced to watch without script. Her husband tried to be strong for both of them, but grief is not a two-person job. It is a contagion that infects the air in a house. He wanted to fix things, book counseling, bring flowers, go through paperwork, but she pushed him away. Some of that was not his fault. Rage and withdrawal had become her defenses. She could not accept his gentle attempts at consolation without feeling they minimized her loss. Their conversations grew stilted. Sometimes they slept in the same bed and felt miles apart. Nights were the loneliest, because even when someone was physically present, the absence of their child made the house cold and sparing of warmth. She found herself avoiding mutual friends, people whose mere presence reminded her of before. At community gatherings, she would stand at the periphery, watching children play as if seeing ghosts. Parents she once chatted with now offered sympathetic smiles, awkward and uncertain how much was appropriate. She learned to interpret their hesitation as judgment, as if they suspected she had not grieved correctly. That made her bristle. Mourning is an individual map, not a checklist. Yet the cultural scripts for grief, memorials, platitudes, staged encouragement, felt inadequate, and their inadequacy made her angrier, more isolated. Sometimes the isolation was self-imposed. She would shut her phone off, let calls go to voicemail, and ignore the ringtone that meant someone cared. It wasn't that she wanted to cut people out. She wanted to avoid the tiny disappointments that accumulate, the one friend who didn't show up, the one person who said the wrong thing, the sermon that offered cold theology instead of a human hand. Each misstep reinforced the idea that people could not hold her pain. Better, she reasoned, to hold it alone than to risk being slighted by another's clumsy consolation. Her relationship with faith communities sank too. Invitations to prayer groups felt like accusations. "Come be with us," they would say, and she would see it as an attempt to fix the unfixable with words. Trust had eroded into suspicion. The rituals that once offered solace now seemed performative. a mirror held up to her absence. Seeing others fold hands and bow heads felt like a private betrayal. How could they find comfort in ritual when she could not find comfort in the one thing she relied on before? The dissonance between their peace and her pain made the distance widen further. Medical appointments, social services, paperwork, every institutional interaction had its own brand of loneliness. The professionals were competent, but their competence was no balm for the gash in her heart. She learned the names of unfamiliar forms, attended meetings, signed affidavits, but each bureaucratic step only underscored the fact that nothing official could restore the sound of her child's laugh. The practicalities of loss, death certificates, funeral arrangements, estate matters were necessary, and they were brutal. They taught her that the world runs on procedures even as it bleeds. At the quietest moments, when the house was empty and the sky turned the color of bruises, she sometimes allowed herself one small, forbidden thought. Perhaps people truly didn't understand. Maybe it was not malice, but helplessness that made their comfort sound hollow. That thought softened her briefly, made the edges of anger less sharp, and she would pick up the phone to call a friend, only to hang up before the courage rippled through her. She wanted connection. She wanted to be held and understood, but the fear of being disappointed again, of having her suffering minimized, kept her from reaching across the gulf. So solitude became a constant companion, chosen and endured. It was a bitter shelter where she could speak the truth she had forbidden herself to say aloud, the accusations, the ugly thoughts, the raw grief. She wrote with a pen that bled onto paper, letters to no one, confessions she never mailed, because the act of naming her pain felt like the only language that belonged to her. It was in those private pages that she was most honest, where she allowed both hatred and longing to coexist without judgment. Solitude shielded her from the wrong words of others. It also, painfully, kept her from the right ones. Her heart grew cold, the way winter settles into old houses, slow, inevitable, and thorough. The raw edges of her grief, once ragged and bleeding, knit over with a crust that turned to stone. Tears no longer came. They had been spent in the first furious months. Smiles felt like a betrayal, a small theft of the memory she guarded. Mornings arrived with the same dull ache, but she met them with a quiet hardness, moving through the motions of life as if she were a statue performing someone else's rituals. Friends, who had once worried about her constant crying, now whispered that she had closed off, as if that were a thing to be diagnosed and fixed. She embraced the label like armor. Call it what you want. It kept the world from reaching the place inside that still hurt the most. She found herself protecting that hollow as though it were precious. When someone tried to offer comfort, she deflected it with curt words, a tilt of the chin, a cold laugh. "No, thank you," she would say, and mean it. It wasn't cruelty so much as a deliberate defense. If she didn't feel, then she couldn't be hurt again. The idea of allowing any tenderness in frightened her more than the prospect of being left alone did. Softness felt like a risk she could not afford. She told herself bravery meant enduring without breaking, and so she built a fortress of indifference around her chest, brick by brick. People began to comment that she had moved on, as if the absence of outward sobs equaled healing. They mistook her stoicism for recovery and returned to their lives. That misreading stung in a new way, and added loneliness that accused her of ingratitude when she had never been given the permission to grieve in peace. Inside, the black hole remained, swallowing small joys and hollowing out celebrations. Birthdays came and went with polite nods and forced smiles, and she found herself hollowed deeper by the mismatch between the world's insistence on normalcy and the ruin she carried inside. Her marriage shifted under the same weight. Where there had once been shared plans and whispered jokes in the dark, now there were only careful silences and separate routines. He tried to coax laughter from her, to plant small moments of light, but she could not reciprocate. His hand on hers at night was met with a cool stillness that did not remember warmth. She wondered sometimes if he loved the ghost of the woman she had been more than the one who remained, if he grieved her absence as much as the child. Those thoughts came and went, sharp as flint, and she pushed them away because compassion from him only reminded her how far she had fallen from being able to receive it. At work, she became efficient and distant, the person who never missed a deadline but never stayed for after-hours jokes. Colleagues admired her competence and commented on her resilience, not seeing that resilience was actually a brittle veneer. When someone offered to cover a shift so she could rest, she refused. "I'm fine," she said, and believed it was true in the only way that mattered. She could function. Functioning was survival. Survival was enough. She clenched her jaw at the idea of asking for help, because asking implied weakness, and weakness was the one luxury she could no longer afford. Nighttimes, once a refuge of softened thoughts and memory, became a ledger of all she refused to feel. She would lie awake rehearsing the things she would never do with her child, the bedtime stories that would never be told, the scraped knees that would never be kissed. Those imaginings had lost their edges. They were numb, like relics wrapped in cloth and stored away. The pain had not gone. It had congealed into a heavy silence that made speech into a kind of theater, expressions performed for a world that couldn't help and might even hurt her more with its attempts. Sometimes in the small hours, she would catch herself saying aloud the sentence she never thought she would: "If God exists, I don't want to know him." The words felt like a wound carved into the air, final, irrevocable. They were not said with heat, but with the flatness of someone who had already traded off hope for certainty. It was a vow of exile from anything that claimed divine purpose in suffering. Better to be a skeptic with a stone heart than to risk the open tenderness of faith and have it crushed again. In that hard logic, she found a grim control. She could choose the terms of her relationship to the world, even if the choice was to be alone. Her appetite for conversations about meaning vanished. When a co-worker brought up a sermon that had helped them, she offered a terse nod and turned the conversation elsewhere. She had become the person who reframed every mention of grace as naive, an outsider looking in at rituals she no longer trusted. Compassion, when shown to her, was deflected as though it were handed to a stranger. She chose this distance as if it were a moral stance, proof that she would not be fooled again by easy answers or soothing clichés. Even memory, which once had been a place to return to and relive the warmth of her child's small victories, became dangerous. She feared nostalgia now because it could pull her into feeling, and feeling was a vulnerability she had sealed. So she let recollections slip into a factual catalogue, dates, objects, pictures. The laughter that once made her chest ache with happiness now registered only as a data point, a time, a place, an event. That intellectualizing saved her from the immediate sting, but it cost her something vital, the ability to be tender again. Still, beneath the stone, there remained a fragile ember. Not hope exactly, but the faintest awareness that she could not stay hard forever and survive fully. It surfaced occasionally in the way her hand would pause over a tiny shoe on the floor, or in a photograph that made the breath catch for a second. Those moments were brief and quickly smothered, because the fortress she had made felt safer than the risk of feeling. She clung to the hardness because it was the one tool she believed would keep the world from finishing what grief had started. For now, that seemed enough. To be unfeeling, indestructible in the small, terrible way that keeps a person moving when the rest of them has been broken. She started to slip without noticing the exact moment the slope became a fall. At first, it was little things, staying up later, pouring a glass to steady her hand, scrolling her phone until dawn, but the small compromises grew teeth. Alcohol that was once an occasional solace became a nightly ritual, the bottle a quiet companion that dulled the edges for a while. Mornings came with headaches and shame. Afternoons were punctuated by the hollow search for anything that would silence the ache. Distractions piled up like quicksand. Binge-watching shows she never remembered the next day, emptier relationships that asked nothing of her, errands run in a fog. The behaviors that once felt like control slowly revealed themselves as chains. She told herself the substances were medicine, anything to take the rawness down a few degrees so she could sleep without the scream behind her ribs. Friends noticed the change and offered concerned looks. She waved them off, practiced excuses, called it a phase. But the more she numbed herself, the louder the hollow became in between the moments of sedation. Emotions that used to arrive as waves now came as avalanches. Guilt, anger, a deep shame for abandoning the person she had once been. Each attempt to quiet the pain only carved the wound deeper, and she found herself surprised by how quickly endurance turned into dependence. With the dulling came riskier choices. She withdrew into company that mirrored the damage, people who drank until their words slurred and their laughs sounded brittle. Nights bled into mornings in unfamiliar bars, in parked cars, in the kind of places where faces blurred and judgment was a currency no one spent. She told herself these places were anonymous, safe and transient, but anonymity bred escalation. She tried things she would never have imagined, flirted with danger as if danger could prove she was still alive. The small rebellions against her old life became a series of self-inflicted shocks meant to distract her from the steady, hollow rhythm of grief. Thoughts that had once been unbearable crept closer and felt less taboo the more she drank. On certain nights, the questions turned to dark rehearsals. What if the world were quiet forever, and she startled at her own calmness when those imaginings came? They weren't plans so much as a numb curiosity, a testing of the limits of her pain. She would wake the next day with a hangover of shame and the sickening realization that she had been flirting with endings she'd previously only mouthed in fury. Those mornings were the worst. The weight of what she'd nearly asked for collided with the fact that she still, somehow, wanted to live, if only to punish herself for being weak. Work became a place she showed up to in pieces. She performed routines on autopilot, meeting expectations with a mechanical precision that hid the chaos beneath. Colleagues noticed the empty eyes, the careless jokes, the cigarette breaks that stretched too long. Once a manager offered to set up counseling through the company, she laughed it off in a way that sounded hollow even to herself and declined. Pride and shame tangled together. Pride that she could still function, shame that she needed help and would not seek it. The mask worked well enough for a while, and the world continued to believe the story she presented. Family interactions frayed further. Her husband's attempts at gentle intervention were met with coldness or silence, and the distance between them widened into an ocean of things left unsaid. Arguments sparked over small things, escalated into blows of words, then flickered out into more silent meals. She could see the fear in his face, the way he searched for the woman he knew beneath the numbness. That look often sent her away because she could not bear the idea of offering him only shards. Blame passed between them like a chilly draught. He blamed the bottle, she blamed the world. Neither of them knew how to say the thing that would start repair without collapsing under the weight of what had been lost. She tried to outrun the memory by changing routines, taking different routes, clearing the spaces that held him, replacing photographs with neutral art. But memory waits in corners and returns at the scent of a laundry detergent or a child's laugh from a passing car. Every attempt at erasure was partial and failed, leaving behind a residue of shame and a sense of treachery toward the boy she had loved. The more she ran, the more the past anchored her. Denial was a brittle vessel, and cracks appeared fast. Those cracks let in the cold and left her shivering in the middle of rooms full of people. Evenings became tests she feared to face. Could she keep from calling his name? Could she bear seeing another family at the park? Each encounter presented a choice, and most nights she chose avoidance. She skipped school plays and birthday parties, donning excuses like armor. The isolation bred more risk-taking because it was easier to destroy herself in private than to explain to friends the brittle reason she couldn't sit through a child's recital without collapsing. The small routines that once tethered her to life, meals, phone calls, short walks, fell away one by one, and the river of withdrawal steepened into something dangerous. There were moments of clarity, sharp and terrible. In the soft light of dawn, she would sometimes see her reflection and feel abhorrence for the person staring back. Hollowed eyes, a face mapped by late nights, a posture that had given up. Those moments were like flashes of truth, where she understood what she had become and felt a surge of panic and self-loathing. She'd promise herself small things, one day sober, one phone call returned, but the promises frayed, undone by the next night's desperation. Regret accumulated like rust, corroding the resolve she pretended to hold. And yet, underneath the spiral of habits and the drugged blur of evenings, a thin, stubborn thread remained, an ember not yet fully extinguished. It was not hope, not in any clear form, but a small refusal to let the darkness have everything. Something in her recoiled at the idea of leaving without a fight, at the thought of abandoning the memory of the child she had loved. That small ember flickered unexpectedly at the sight of a neighbor's gentle hand in a morning when the coffee tasted slightly less bitter, in a text message she read and did not delete. Those tiny interruptions in the pattern were fragile, but they were enough to keep the descent from becoming a finality. They made room, faint and precarious, for the possibility that one day she might choose differently. Her scream tore through the empty room, echoing back as though the walls themselves mocked her. She had never felt so raw, so abandoned, so invisible. She wanted the heavens to split open, for lightning to answer her fury, for anything to prove there was someone listening. But the silence pressed heavier than her words, a suffocating void that mocked every ounce of pain she poured into the air. She collapsed onto the floor, her fists pounding against the cold tiles, tears she thought had dried long ago, flooding again. For the first time in months, the anger wasn't numb. It was sharp, unbearable, and alive. The night stretched like an endless corridor, and she felt herself unraveling in it. The bottle that had dulled her for so long was empty beside her, but even drunken haze couldn't mute the ache now. Her mind replayed every moment of her child's life, each laugh and cry, until it felt like knives were carving her chest from the inside. She kept asking why, over and over, her voice breaking. Why him? Why not me? Why at all? The questions had no answers, only silence. And that silence pushed her deeper into the pit she had dug around herself. She thought maybe she had finally reached the place beyond pain, the place where nothing mattered. For a fleeting instant, she flirted with the idea of surrendering completely, ending it, joining him. The thought didn't terrify her anymore. It whispered like a lullaby, tempting her with rest. She imagined closing her eyes and never waking up, imagined release from the relentless torment. It was the closest she had come to believing in anything since his death, and that belief was chilling. But even as she considered it, something within her trembled, an ember refusing to extinguish, even when surrounded by darkness. She whispered curses again, softer this time, as though bargaining with a god she swore she didn't believe in. "If you're real," she spat through her tears, "you're cruel, you're heartless. You take children and leave mothers to rot. You should have taken me too." The words were venom, but underneath them lay desperation, an aching, almost pleading desire for an answer. She hated that she wanted him to respond. She hated that even in her rebellion, she longed for proof that she wasn't screaming into emptiness. The clock ticked on, each second slicing through the silence. She noticed the sound more than ever, its persistence mocking her stillness. Time kept moving, life kept pushing forward, but she remained stuck in the same night of loss that had destroyed her world. That realization deepened her despair, because it meant the world would keep spinning without her son, and worse, without her. She wanted everything to stop, to freeze in acknowledgement of her pain, but nothing did. The normalcy of it all was unbearable. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't let go. Every corner of the house felt haunted. His toys still boxed in the closet, his favorite blanket folded on the chair, the faint echo of his laughter still clinging to the walls. The house had become a museum of absence, and tonight it suffocated her. She felt as though she were drowning in memories, each one pulling her further down. She shouted again, her voice hoarse and broken, "Do you even see me? Do you even care?" But again, no thunder, no voice, no sign. Only her breath shaking, only the walls holding her pain. It made her angrier, made her feel mocked for even expecting a response. She wondered if maybe the silence was the answer, that God truly wasn't real, or worse, that he was and simply didn't care. That thought carved deeper than any blade ever could, because it meant her suffering had no purpose, no redemption, only emptiness. She sat there for what felt like hours, knees pulled to her chest, her body rocking gently as if trying to cradle itself. She wasn't praying, at least not intentionally, but her heart whispered things her mouth couldn't say. It whispered for relief, for rest, for her child's face one more time. The irony struck her. Even as she cursed him, she couldn't stop herself from reaching toward him in her brokenness. The contradiction twisted her soul in knots. Her rage eventually burned itself into exhaustion. No lightning came. No voice from heaven thundered back. Only the quiet, only her sobs softening into weary gasps. She had screamed her last words into the night, convinced no one heard. And yet, beneath the despair, something unsettled stirred. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, almost waiting. She didn't understand it, didn't want to admit it, but deep down, she felt she hadn't been alone in that room. When morning finally broke, pale light seeping through the curtains, she was still on the floor. Her body ached, her throat burned, but she was alive. She hated that she was alive, yet she couldn't deny the smallest flicker inside her. Something in her chest, buried beneath the ashes of rage, whispered that the story wasn't over. She ignored it, buried it under resentment, but it was there nonetheless. An ember, glowing faintly in the ashes of her breakdown. Months crawled by after that night on the floor, each one a small grey world she moved through without expectation. Then, without fanfare, life folded a new, impossible thing into the calendar. A positive test. At first, she stared at the tiny stick as if it were a joke played by a merciless fate. She had not planned for this, had not wanted it, and yet the pink line stared back as if daring her to hope. Her first impulse was not joy, but a sudden, dizzying fear. How could she carry anything forward when the weight of loss still dragged at her ankles? The news felt like a mirror held up to everything she had sworn off, a mirror that reflected both longing and terror. She kept the secret for a few days, as if privacy could change the calculus of impossibility. Admitting it aloud felt like inviting the world to watch a slow collapse. But soon there was no hiding from the practicalities. An appointment, an ultrasound, the sterile smell of the clinic. The nurse's smile was gentle, the questions routine, but inside her chest, 1,000 alarms pinged. She told herself this was impossible, that the body that had broken from sleepless nights and raw grief could not be a vessel of new life. Still, the tiny heartbeat on the machine, barely a flicker, arrived like a protest she had not anticipated. When she met the doctor's eyes, she expected a smile, a blanket of reassurance. Instead, he was clinical, guarded. He used words that felt like verdicts. High risk, low uterine resilience, medical fragility. He explained that her body had endured trauma, physiological and emotional, that could make sustaining a pregnancy unlikely. Her medical history, the stress hormones, the months of poor nutrition and disrupted sleep, all stacked against this little life. He offered options, tests, and a protocol that read like a series of fences around something fragile. To them, The rational conclusion was clear. It would be a miracle if the pregnancy continued. Her husband listened to the medical assessment with a face carved in worry. He had been the tether through the rough months, practical, patient, quietly breaking in ways she couldn't see. At first he offered the kind of hope that was practical: extra rest, a nutrition plan, cancellation of stresses. He wanted to believe, wanted to protect her from the naively hopeful fantasies that might shatter again. Yet in private, when he held her hand in the quiet of the night, she could hear his heart trembling with the same mix of terror and longing that lived in her own chest. They were both walking a wire strung across a canyon, one misstep away from falling. Word leaked anyway. How could it not? Small kindnesses and small fears travel faster than anyone intends. Some friends reached out with cautious congratulations, their voices soft, as if addressing porcelain. Others kept their distance, unsure how to navigate the improbable. Some church members offered prayers, a ritual she had refused to name for months. Their faith felt foreign now, sometimes cloying, sometimes tender. When a woman from the congregation slipped a printed prayer into her hand, the paper felt like a relic from another life, and her reaction was a mixture of gratitude and discomfort she could not easily sort. Every appointment became a high-stakes test. She learned charting schedules, learned to rest when her body screamed to move. Each ultrasound was a cliff-edge moment. Flicker, silence, breath held. The doctors ran tests that produced spreadsheets of numbers and probabilities. Each normal result felt like a small rented piece. Each deviation opened a cavern of worry. The world of white coats and clinical calm could not soothe the deeper fear that life might start only to be taken again. She found herself bargaining with the universe in low, private ways, whispering promises she knew were foolish, if anyone heard them. Despite the doctor's caution, small signs began to bloom like stubborn green through winter. A morning nausea that arrived with the light, the soft shift of an appetite returning in the afternoons, a tenderness she could not explain that was neither wholly pain nor wholly joy. These sensations were treacherous, too pleasing, too fragile, but they forced a crevice of wonder to open within her hardened heart. Each tiny change was a contradiction she did not want to enjoy, but could not help. She would walk to the window and watch a neighbor's child chase a pigeon and feel both bitter and quietly, absurdly grateful for the proof that life continued. At night she would imagine the impossible. A small body, the rise of a tiny chest, a name she would say aloud and hear. Those imaginings were dangerous. She guarded them like contraband thoughts. She had learned the hard way that hope can be weaponized into a source of fresh pain. And yet the thought of a small hand curling around her finger, the possibility of lullabies, the echo of a laugh crept into her and unsettled the bedrock of her anger. It did what no argument or logic could. It softened a place she had turned into stone. Her disbelief did not evaporate. If anything, it complicated everything. She still felt anger at the heavens, still carried the bitter sentences she had shouted into nights before. How could she reconcile the image of a God who allowed her son's life to be cut short with the possibility that this new life had been given as answer or mercy? The questions circled and returned like winter crows, relentless and unsatisfied. Yet alongside the questions, an uneasy curiosity began to grow. What if this could be more than chance? What if some hand she had cursed had guided this fragile thing into being? As the months edged forward, the medical team cautioned, rechecked, and monitored. Each appointment was a gauntlet she faced with a mix of pragmatism and clandestine hope. The house, once sealed in silence, slowly gathered a new kind of tension. A careful hush around the idea of what might come. She did not claim the future, far from it, but she also could not bear to throw away the small, cautious glimpses of life that had chosen to arrive in the middle of her ruin. The unexpected had arrived, unwelcome and wholly at once, and it began to pry open a door she had sworn she'd keep nailed shut. Fear arrived like a cold hand at her throat, steady and uncompromising. The positive test that should have brought joy instead opened a new layer of terror. Every tender moment of relief felt edged with the memory of loss. She thought of the months ahead and saw them shaded by the old grief. What if this child, too, was taken? What if hope only led her back to another grave? Those questions looped in her mind, each one a hammer blow. She found herself watching her belly as if it were fragile glass, flinching at the slightest cramp, the softest twinge. Every small sign of life became a potential omen of pain. Visiting the clinic for scans felt like stepping onto a stage where the next scene could be a tragedy. The sterile room, the slow hum of machines, the technician's calm voice, all of it tightened her chest. She clenched the edge of the examination table until her knuckles whitened, counting breaths like prayers she did not trust. When the technician said the baby's heartbeat was present, relief washed through her, but it was thin and shaky, as if any moment could tear it away. She told herself not to celebrate, not to name anything aloud, and yet the urge to whisper a name at night surprised her with its tenderness. Sleep betrayed her. Nights became battlegrounds, where her imagination staged both the worst and the most tender possibilities. She dreamed of small hands and lullabies, and woke up shaking, the dream dissolving into the chilling certainty that dreams could be stolen. Sometimes, between one shallow sleep and another, she would imagine the child's face, and then curse herself for letting hope bloom. Guilt followed like a shadow. To want joy felt disloyal to the child she had lost, and to deny it felt like smothering something alive inside her. The ambivalence exhausted her. Her husband tried to anchor her with practical routines, vitamin schedules, gentle reminders to rest, meals cooked with care, but even his kindness had a tentative edge, as if he too feared investing in something that might be taken. They spoke in softer tones, careful not to jinx the fragile progress. In these hushed conversations, both of them admitted fear, not always with words. Sometimes a look at the ultrasound photo said more than either could say aloud. They were partners in guarded hope, watching one another for signs of collapse, and steadied by small mutual acts of care. Every medical appointment felt like a cliff edge. A normal result was a small, guarded victory. A complication, no matter how slight, sent her spiraling. Doctors mapped out probabilities, recommended rest, monitored hormone levels and placental development, but charts and statistics felt like cold armor against a mother's raw terror. She found herself bargaining quietly, promising small things she couldn't keep, if only this life would continue. The bargaining was private and ridiculous and real. If this one lives, I'll do anything. Saying it aloud felt like sacrilege, and also like the only prayer she could manage in the ruins of her certainty. Friends' congratulations landed awkwardly. Some offered joy too quickly, their voices bright and tentative, and she pushed them away because their happiness felt like a challenge to the grief that still lived inside her. Others kept to a careful silence, offering support but not celebration. She envied those whose joy came easily. She resented the world for spinning on as if tragedy had not carved a canyon through her life. Still, when a neighbor dropped off soup or a message arrived that read, "I'm praying for you," a confusing warmth stirred, an ember that she was both guarded about and secretly grateful for. As the weeks passed, small wonders crept in. A sudden craving that made her laugh through tears, a flutter in her belly that felt impossibly tender, the morning sickness that, though awful, proved life was rooting itself. Each sign was a contradiction, joy wrapped in fear, and she responded with a cautious reverence she had not permitted herself since the early days of grief. These moments softened something inside her, not enough to erase the past, but enough to crack the stone she had become. She began, hesitantly, to hum a lullaby she half remembered, stopping whenever the sound threatened to become hope. Fear and hope began to dance in her chest, awkward partners, alternating steps. At times she moved toward life, setting a tiny onesie in a drawer and smoothing it as if it were a sacrament. At other times, she retreated, afraid that such preparation invited loss. She found herself masking the preparation with pragmatism, buying neutral blankets, researching pediatricians as if she were a cautious project manager, because action felt safer than surrendering to joy. The small practicalities were her lifelines, tiny ways to claim the future without fully trusting it. Beneath the fear, though, a little ember glowed more steadily than before. It was fragile and easily smothered, but it survived the small storms. The ember whispered that maybe, just maybe, life could rise from the ruin. She did not shout this truth from rooftops. She held it like a secret between herself and the life that grew within her. In the quietest hours, when the house slept, she laid a hand over her belly and let the silence answer, with a faint, impossible sense that the story had not ended with loss. It was an unexpected companion, terror braided with a stubborn, tender hope. The first time the doctor looked puzzled instead of grave, she felt her own heartbeat stumble. He leaned closer to the monitor, adjusted the probe, and then repeated the test with a furrowed brow, not of worry, but disbelief. The baby's growth, once predicted to be stunted or impossible, was now right on track. The heartbeat pulsed, strong, steady, insistent. She blinked, waiting for the but, the hesitation, the careful caveat she had grown used to hearing. But it didn't come. Instead, he said softly, almost reluctantly, "This is remarkable." She felt the word echo inside her, heavy with meaning. In the weeks that followed, each appointment became less about grim statistics and more about astonishment. The doctors, who had once spoken to her like a fragile case study, now leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads, searching for words that made sense of what they were seeing. They still used clinical terms: unexpected progression, highly unlikely improvement, unprecedented stability. But beneath their professionalism, she could hear the tremor of something more human: wonder. Their explanations became longer, more hesitant, as if science was straining to keep up with what her womb was quietly proving. Every time she heard the steady rhythm of her child's heart, it felt like the sound was speaking to her directly. It wasn't just a biological pulse anymore. It was a whisper cutting through her layers of disbelief. She would lie awake at night, recalling that sound, letting it drown out the echoes of grief. It soothed her in ways she had not thought possible, like a voice saying, "This is not the end. This is life again." For the first time in months, she found herself resting her hand on her belly, not out of fear, but out of connection. It startled her how natural it felt. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the waiting room after another surprisingly positive checkup, tears rolled down her face. Tears not of despair, but of awe. People glanced at her, not knowing her story, not knowing how close she had been to giving up. She didn't care. Something was shifting inside her, something she couldn't control or deny. Against her own resistance, against her vows of disbelief, she felt wonder growing, and with wonder came questions she thought she had buried forever. What if I was wrong? What if someone is listening? What if this is more than chance? Her friends and family noticed the change too. She still bristled at overly religious platitudes, but she no longer cut people off when they spoke gently of hope. When someone said, "I've been praying for you," she no longer recoiled. Instead, a strange warmth spread through her chest, even if she didn't admit it aloud. It was as if their faith, which she had once despised, was now weaving itself into her story without her permission. She caught herself thinking about their prayers at night, wondering if they somehow had something to do with what was happening inside her. As her belly grew, so did her conflicted heart. She still carried fear, yes, but it was no longer an all-consuming monster. It was tempered now by something she didn't yet want to name. She caught herself smiling when she felt a kick, laughing quietly when the baby rolled, as if to remind her, "I'm here." Those small movements became her private sermons, messages written not on paper but in her own flesh. She didn't need a preacher. Her child's body was preaching something louder than words. Life where there should have been none. Hope where there had been ashes. The doctors began calling her pregnancy a case worth documenting. They invited residents to observe, murmured about publishing notes. She sat in those sterile rooms, listening to their fascination, and realized they were circling around something they couldn't name. For her, it wasn't data points anymore. It was personal. Every chart, every surprise smile from a doctor was another crack in the wall she had built against faith. It unnerved her because the one conclusion she didn't want to admit was becoming harder to avoid. This wasn't just science. This was something beyond. One night, she dreamed of her lost child, not in the familiar nightmares of absence, but in a scene filled with light. In the dream, the child smiled and pointed toward her belly, and though she woke with tears, they were not bitter ones. The image lingered, haunting and comforting all at once. It felt like a message, though she still resisted the word. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of her subconscious, but the more the baby inside her thrived, the more that dream felt like a thread connecting her grief and her new hope. With each passing week, the impossible became normal. Checkups were no longer dreaded, they were anticipated. She began to keep the ultrasound pictures, not hiding them away, but pinning them on the fridge where she could see them daily. That act terrified her. It was commitment, acknowledgement, trust. But it also thrilled her. Each time she looked at those grainy images, she whispered something she had sworn never to say again. Please stay. It wasn't a prayer, she told herself. And yet, deep down, she knew it was the closest thing to one she had spoken in a long time. By the time the third trimester arrived, her doctors had stopped saying impossible. They now spoke of delivery plans, nutrition, rest. She sat there in stunned silence, listening to words she had never expected to hear. Healthy, thriving, on track. Her chest tightened, her throat burned, and for the first time since her loss, she allowed herself to cry without anger. The tears fell heavy, but they carried relief instead of bitterness. She knew she had reached a turning point, not only in her pregnancy, but in her heart. Something greater was at work, and though she didn't yet dare to name it, she could feel it pressing against her walls. It was no longer just a baby growing inside her. Something deeper was being born. The day of birth arrived with both terror and trembling hope. She had spent months preparing herself for every possible heartbreak, convinced that even at the last moment, the miracle might slip away. Yet as the labor pains came stronger, something inside her shifted. She felt the weight of fear, yes, but also the strange undercurrent of anticipation, as though the very walls of the hospital room whispered, "This is different." Doctors and nurses bustled around her, their voices firm and clinical. But her heart beat louder than any instruction, a drum of desperation and longing for the child she thought she would never hold. When the cry came, it broke through the air like lightning, a single raw wail that shattered months of silence, despair, and doubt. Her body shook with sobs the moment she heard it. She hadn't even seen him yet, but the sound alone was enough to undo her, to bring her to her knees in spirit. It wasn't just her baby crying, it was life itself, screaming into her darkness. The nurses placed him on her chest, and she stared in disbelief at the warm, wriggling weight resting against her skin. He was real. He was here, and against everything she had once believed, he was alive. Her tears poured freely, unstoppable rivers that carried the bitterness of years. She wept for the child she had lost, for the cruel words she had hurled at the heavens, for the nights when she begged for death instead of life. Every tear seemed to wash something away, leaving her raw but strangely whole. Gratitude surged like a flood she could not contain, mixed with sorrow, mixed with awe. She pressed her lips against the newborn's head and whispered, "I don't deserve you." The words slipped out unplanned, but they were true. She felt the weight of mercy in her arms. The doctors looked at her with the kind of amazement they usually reserved for rare phenomena. They congratulated her, spoke of resilience, of medical marvels, but she barely heard them. Their voices blurred into background noise, like static compared to the piercing clarity of her son's heartbeat against her chest. She realized in that moment that no explanation, no chart, no diagnosis could capture what had just happened. This was not supposed to be possible. She had been told again and again to expect loss, to prepare for grief. Instead, she held a miracle. Family members rushed in, their faces lit with joy and disbelief. Some cried with her, some laughed through their tears. A few whispered, "Praise God." And for the first time, she didn't recoil. She didn't flinch. She let the words wash over her, not as an insult, not as a dagger, but as a truth she could no longer deny. Deep inside, something cracked open. She remembered her curses, her screams of hatred, her fists shaking toward the sky. Now all she could feel was a trembling humility, the sense that she had been answered even when she had demanded silence. As she held him longer, memories collided within her, the grave silence of her first loss, the echo of her accusations, the pit of her despair. She thought of that night when she shouted at the heavens to take her too, when she begged for an end. Yet here she was, cradling a new beginning. It felt like both judgment and mercy at once, as though she had been broken to the ground so that she could understand the depth of this gift. For the first time in years, she whispered words she thought she'd never say again. "Thank you." The gratitude frightened her as much as it healed her. She didn't want to admit belief too quickly, didn't want to feel like she was betraying the child she had lost. But holding this new life, watching his tiny fingers curl around hers, she knew she had to face the undeniable. Something greater had intervened. Something had answered her in spite of her rage. She felt herself caught between regret and relief, between shame for the curses she had spoken and wonder for the mercy she now touched. That night, alone in the hospital room, when everyone else had gone home, she stared at her son sleeping beside her. The room was quiet, but not empty. For the first time since the tragedy that had crushed her, she didn't feel abandoned. She remembered the dark silence of her cries months ago, the void that swallowed her words. Now, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, alive with presence. She didn't dare name it yet, but she knew she wasn't alone. She touched her baby's chest lightly, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, and whispered again, "Thank you." The words trembled, broken, but they were real. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking to herself, wasn't just releasing air. She knew she was speaking upward, to someone who had been listening all along. The gratitude welled up, mixed with a quiet plea. "Don't let me lose him. Don't let me go back to the darkness." As she realized she was praying, really praying, for the first time since childhood. By dawn, she understood something profound. This birth was more than a medical event, more than a random chance. It was an answer she hadn't wanted, an answer she hadn't expected, but one that had broken through her rebellion. She had cursed God with every fiber of her being, and yet he had placed this miracle in her arms. Holding her son, she realized that this wasn't just his beginning, it was hers too. A new chapter, not built on rage and emptiness, but on mercy and a second chance she didn't deserve, but had been given. Holding that tiny, warm body against her chest, memories rose like a tide she had tried so hard to dam. Faces of nights she'd screamed at the sky flashed through her mind. The raw words, the fists shaken toward heaven, the bitter promises never to bow again. She tasted those curses as if they were poison on her tongue, felt the shame of each one settle heavy in her bones. How had she dared speak that way? How had she accused the one she now felt had answered? The questions came faster than answers, and with each one, her throat tightened until she could scarcely breathe. She thought of the exact moments She had spat out those accusations, a hospital corridor, a dark kitchen, a floor slick with tears. Each recollection was a small dagger, because they were not just words spoken in anger, but declarations that had hardened into an identity. I do not want you. And now she cradled the living proof that things had not ended where she had sworn they would. The contradiction stunned her. If there was mercy at all, how could it have reached her despite everything she had hurled like stones? Guilt washed over her in waves. It wasn't only embarrassment, it felt like a moral deficit, the sense that she had begged and fought and cursed while a hand reached toward her all along. She found herself whispering apologies, short, awkward, inadequate, into the baby's soft hair, as if the tiny body could carry them upward. The thought that she might have been graced in spite of her rage unsettled her humility. She had expected punishment, reckoning, at least indifference. Instead, she had been given life. That truth reshaped the landscape of her heart. She looked at her own reflection in the hospital window and hardly recognized the woman who had screamed at night. The hard lines of exhaustion softened as she considered the possibility that she had been known fully, anger, curse, and all, and still not abandoned. It felt like being caught in an act and forgiven anyway. Tears came then, not only for what she had lost, but for what she had been, and how small her courage had been to believe she could survive without grace. The tears were heavy with contrition. Words that had once felt like armor now sounded like chains. She realized how much the anger had protected her from vulnerability, yet that same armor had kept out tenderness, mercy, and the possibility of being held. In the hush of the postpartum night, she let herself remember not only the curses, but the soft hands that had tried to comfort her, the prayers she'd rebuffed, the open arms she'd pushed away. Each memory was a slender rope to pull her back from the cliff of bitterness she had dwelled on for so long. Humility arrived not as a sudden conversion, but as a slow melting. She did not pretend to have neat answers for the mystery of why one child had been taken and another spared. She simply felt, with a clarity that cut through her rhetoric, that mercy had met her in the most unexpected way. The question that rose now was different. Not, where were you, but what will I do with this gift? That question felt holy and terrifying at once, because it asked something of her beyond relief. It asked for a response. In the days that followed, the remembrance did not stop at private confession. It crept into small acts, a whispered sorry to a friend she'd snapped at, a longer embrace for her husband who had held the house together, a hesitant nod when a neighbor offered a prayer. She found herself listening differently when others spoke about faith. She no longer jumped to rebuttal. Instead, she listened to learn, to gather what she might not yet be ready to name. The memory of her curses became a teacher, showing her the distance she had come and the careful tenderness she now owed to life. And beneath everything, a trembling gratitude settled where hardness once lived. It was not a tidy gratitude, nor an easy faith. It was a fragile, fumbling thing that forced her to confront the depth of her own brokenness and the greater depth of mercy that had reached into it. Holding her son, she promised, first in thought, then in broken, stumbling prayer, that she would not waste what had been given. She would let the memory of her own anger and the miracle that answered it reshape the rest of her days. In that quiet room, the weight of life and death seemed to rest entirely upon her shoulders. With the newborn cradled beside her, she realized there was no strength left in her own hands, no explanation that could hold together everything she had lived through. So, she fell to her knees, but not like before, not in anger or defiance. This time, her body yielded in surrender. Tears streamed down her face, soaking the cold floor, while her trembling voice whispered, "Thank you." The word left her lips small and fragile, yet it carried a depth she had never known. It was as though every drop of pain she had poured out over the years now transformed into a river of gratitude. She gave thanks not only for the life that had come against all odds, but also for the fact that she herself had survived the abyss. Somehow, broken and weary, she discovered that her weakness was the very space where she could finally be rebuilt. Her heart, once hardened like stone, began to beat with a new softness. For the first time, she did not resist, did not demand, did not curse. She simply opened her hands as if releasing something she had carried for far too long. And as she let go, she felt an ancient weight lift. The pain might never disappear completely, but there was now a certainty that she would not carry it alone. That surrender was more than a fleeting moment. It became a turning point. It carved itself into her story as a line in the sand. Before, she had been a woman of fury and despair. Now, she was a mother touched by the miracle of mercy. She finally understood she controlled nothing, not life, not death, not tomorrow. But she could choose to trust, she could choose to surrender, and in that paradox, she found a peace she had never known. Her whisper became a prayer. I know I don't deserve it, yet you loved me. I know I denied you, yet you still heard me. I know I cursed you, yet you gave me grace. Simple words, but they burned like fire within her soul, melting away pride and igniting humility. It was not the beginning of a perfect life, but of a surrendered one. From that day forward, every glance at the child in her arms was also a glance toward heaven. Every heartbeat of the baby was a living reminder that hope could bloom even in the driest soil. And in the silence of her surrender, she understood the emptiness that once consumed her was being filled with something greater than pain, greater than loss. It was being filled with love. She now shares her story with the world, not out of pride, but out of an overwhelming sense of duty. What once began as cries of rage against heaven has become a testimony of redemption that she never thought possible. Standing before others, whether in small gatherings or larger crowds, she tells them about her journey from blasphemy to belief, from despair to miracle. Her words are heavy with lived truth, for she does not speak of theory or religion as an abstract concept. She speaks of scars that still ache, of nights when she cursed God with all her being, and of the unexplainable grace that pursued her anyway. She knows that every listener carries wounds of their own, and so she speaks carefully, not to preach, but to show that if mercy could find her, it can find anyone. When she describes the moment she lost her child, the room often falls silent. She does not soften the details, because pain itself cannot be softened, it must be faced. She tells them about the suffocating darkness, the endless nights of hatred, the emptiness that made her question why life itself should continue. And she does not hide the shame of the words she once shouted toward heaven. I cursed him, she admits, her voice trembling. I told God he was cruel. I told him he was false. I told him I never wanted to know him. Some gasp, others lower their eyes, but she lifts her head, for the power of the story is not in her rebellion, but in what came after. It is in the fact that despite everything, God did not abandon her. Her testimony is not polished or rehearsed. At times her voice cracks and tears roll freely as memories return. But those tears are not only of sorrow, they are also of wonder. She explains how she discovered that God can endure even our greatest fury, even our harshest accusations. I thought my anger would drive him away, she confesses, but instead he drew closer. He waited patiently until the moment I could finally see. For her, this is the essence of grace, that God does not love the version of us we try to present to the world, but the broken, angry, bitter version we hide. That is the person he redeems. When she reaches the part about her unexpected pregnancy, her voice grows softer, as though she still cannot quite believe it herself. She describes the doctor's face when he told her it was impossible, how the words, "Your body cannot carry this child," echoed in her ears like another cruel sentence. Yet against all reason, the child grew. Every ultrasound became a sermon. Every beat of the tiny heart became a whisper of divine possibility. I had no faith left, she tells them, yet God gave me a miracle I did not even ask for. He gave me life where there should have been none. At this, listeners often cry with her, for they see in her story the hope that something greater than science or circumstance is at work in the world. Then comes the climax, the birth. She describes holding the child in her arms, her body shaking with sobs. "I wept as though my soul itself were breaking open," she says, "because for the first time I understood that God had not been cruel. He had been merciful. He had been patient. He had been waiting for me." She does not pretend that the pain of losing her first child disappeared. That wound will never vanish. But now she sees even in that loss a strange thread of redemption, because in her grief she had reached the bottom of herself, and it was there, in the ashes, that she encountered a love greater than her hate. Her story does not end with the miracle of new life, but with the transformation of her heart. She tells of the day she fell to her knees, not in rage but in surrender. "For years, my knees touched the ground in defiance," she says, "but that day they touched in gratitude." She prayed words that once would have choked her throat. "Thank you." And in that surrender, she felt the weight of years lift. "God took my brokenness," she tells them, "and turned it into something whole." The silence in the room when she says this is sacred, as though everyone understands they are standing on holy ground. Her testimony now serves as a weapon against despair. She reminds others that anger does not disqualify them from God's love, nor does doubt, nor even blasphemy. "You cannot scare him away," she insists. "Your rage cannot overwhelm him. Your bitterness cannot chase him off. He is bigger than your pain. He is stronger than your hate. And when you are finished screaming, he will still be there." These words pierce deeply, because so many listening have screamed their own accusations at heaven in secret. Now, for the first time, they hear that such honesty doesn't close the door to God. It can be the very path that leads them to Him. She often closes her story with the image of her child sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Every breath he takes is a sermon," she says. "Every smile is a hymn. Every step he takes is proof that God writes endings we cannot imagine." She wants the world to understand that miracles are not only about healing bodies or restoring what was lost. Sometimes the greatest miracle is a heart restored, a soul revived, a broken person learning to hope again. And in her case, God did all of it, the child in her arms and the faith in her heart. Now, when she walks into a room, people no longer see the bitter, angry woman she once was. They see someone transformed by grace. Her scars are still visible, but they shine like windows, letting the light of God pass through. She declares boldly that her life is proof of a love that does not fail. And though she once hated the very mention of His name, now she cannot stop speaking it. "Jesus," she says with conviction, "is the only reason I am still here. He is the reason I have breath, the reason I have hope, the reason I have joy." The same mouth that cursed Him now proclaims Him, and that in itself is the greatest miracle. Her testimony ends where her life continues, with surrender. She leaves her listeners with one final truth. "I am not strong because I survived. I am strong because I surrendered. I am alive because He gave me life when I deserved nothing but death. And I am here to tell you, no matter how far you have run, no matter what words you have shouted, His love is greater than your pain. He is waiting for you." And with those words, she closes, leaving behind not just a story, but an invitation. For in her pain and redemption, others glimpse their own hope, that if God could reach her at her darkest, He can reach anyone.